Shalom, friends, and welcome to this episode of the Watchdog. Thank you for joining us tonight. I am your host, CJ Cox, here to tell you that we are living in biblical times, and you are watching this on the TheCynicogue news. The TheCynicogue is, of course, the only place you can find the Watchdog, so if you like that, definitely go ahead and subscribe. Let's go ahead and get to some of the channel housekeeping that obviously is a good little segue into that, right? So if you guys are here with me right now, please remember to like and share this video. Please consider subscribing if you have not done so. Please consider hitting that bell to get notified every time that we go live, which is supposed to be Monday, Wednesday, and Friday when we do this podcast. And of course, miscellaneously, we might do open rooms and debates if we can get them. And please consider, of course, helping us out on our alternative media backups as well. This is a relatively controversial show already, right? We've already got YouTube to take down a couple of the videos that we've put up here. So if you guys are interested in this content and want to be watching it consistently, please do remember to subscribe to our accounts on Rumble as well as BitChute. The links to those are being dropped into the live chat right now. And you can also find links to those in the description if you're interested in that. And again, that is, of course, because of the fact that we have already gotten some videos taken down here, despite having only 38 measly subscribers. And if indeed we ever end up getting completely yanked, we obviously need to utilize these alternative sources as backups. So if you guys are interested, please consider subscribing there as well. Also, you should be using alternative platforms anyways, because if you really have a problem with social media overlordship, in the case of Twitter and Facebook and Google and so on and so forth, well, the way you get to fight that as an American in a capitalist system is quite awesome. You can literally use the competition. It's that simple, right? So if you're the kind of person who wants to fight against those things, please do consider not just getting on BitChute and Rumble, but also getting on Gab, Parler, Minds, and other different alternative social media platforms as well. Now, of course, if you're not a social media kind of person, or if you're only into like Facebook, which doesn't seem to have its own clone, or you like a lot of the entertainment things, which so far haven't made their way onto alternative video streaming sites, of course, I understand the different reasons you might not want to get on there. But if it's something that you're on here for political reasons or religious reasons anyways, or you want to follow this particular podcast, or you're already on Twitter or something along those lines, right? Just consider going ahead and subbing to not only this account, but of course, just making an account and following the people who it is that you would like to follow. Want to remind people who have not seen it yet, we did have an interview with Idaho gubernatorial candidate Ammon Bundy last Friday. That is so far the most viewed video on the channel, which I definitely appreciate from you guys. If anybody hasn't checked it out yet, definitely go ahead and check that out. Great interview. And that's really all we have as far as channel housekeeping, I think, with the exception, actually, that some of you guys may see the TheCynicogue News logo has again had a slight update. Still the same thing I showed you guys before, right? The Captain America shield with the TheCynicogue character, the Neanderthal character in the middle, TheCynicogue News on the top, think like a Neanderthal on the bottom, right? But now we have it looking more 3D with the shine on it, metallic, like a shield, all really cool. I definitely appreciate it. That comes from Nicholas Whitmer, if anybody wants to know who was doing the art there. That's who the credit is for. And this show has actually gotten a lot cooler because of help from people who have just decided that they want to help us, right? So that's obviously really cool. If anybody here is interested in helping with a few other things, specifically animation and video editing, we are looking to set up not only for this show, but also for my apologetic show on the other channel, intros, outros, and transitions. So if you guys are interested in helping with that, definitely do let me know. So Let's get right into the episode for today. But actually, briefly, I want to acknowledge some people who I have in the live chat. So let's go ahead and check that out. I see we have Kyle and Kevin. Shalom to both of you. Thank you very much for joining us here today. I appreciate you guys tremendously. Hope that this is obviously worth your time and that we're able to present some informative and important news for you, because obviously that's the reason you're watching the news, right? Well, listen in this case, but nonetheless, let's go ahead and get right into it. So the pre-article discussion is going to break with tradition by actually being an article. In other words, we're not having a pre-article discussion today. We're just going to have one particular article that I'm not going to talk about as long as we typically talk about some of the rest of them. So, that's how this is going to work in this particular case today. However, let's get right into it. Julian Assange has had a appeal hearing date set, and it's very soon. In fact, it's only in a couple of days, 2 days to be precise. Now, for those of you who don't know, which I highly doubt is anybody who is watching this program, Julian Assange is, of course, the founder of WikiLeaks, and he was recently arrested after hiding out for quite some time at the Ecuadorian embassy in, I believe it was Britain. I think it was actually in London in particular, if I'm not mistaken. And he was hanging out there for quite some time, actually was being given some level of diplomatic immunity. And I know there's a specific word for somebody who gets refuge in a certain country for diplomatic immunity reasons, but the word is fleeting me at the moment, so I apologize. But nonetheless, he was sitting there for quite some time, somewhat protected, but also kind of losing his mind a little bit, and, being sieged in a way. Eventually, he did end up getting arrested. Obviously, now he is in custody and has been going through a bunch of different people, Great Britain, Australia, a whole bunch of different nations actually have a problem with Julian Assange. So a lot of people want to charge him. Asylum. Thank you, Kyle. Asylum. Thank you. He had asylum in Ecuador. That is the word. But anyways, that is important, because obviously that's an important thing to get right. So I appreciate that tremendously. But anyways, he did obviously get arrested. The different nations of the world are charging him and passing him around and getting all the different court dates set. And he does now have a hearing, a preliminary hearing, scheduled for August the 11th, which is only, and this is in the United States, to be clear, which is only 2 days away, of course, from today. And in fact, is a Wednesday, which is one of the days that we try to do these watchdogs. So hopefully we might actually have something to report on in regards to this case on Wednesday. But nonetheless, he has had his preliminary hearing scheduled, and it is going to be this Wednesday. His charges have a lot to do with WikiLeaks itself, of course. He has been included in many different, what you might call scandals, although it's usually just him exposing the scandals, but obviously that's something that's not allowed. But nonetheless, these are including but not limited to Chelsea Manning's revelation that there was indiscriminate slaughter of Iraqi civilians in around 2006, 2007, and that it was being covered up by officers actually all the way up to the Pentagon level. Julian Assange also dropped the Hillary Clinton email dump. Julian Assange also dropped the evidence of, I believe it was NOAA. It might not have been NOAA, but it was one of the major climate change activist groups at the UN level, at the international level, revealed that they were actually fudging with the numbers to try and make it seem like climate change was a bigger problem than it actually was. That was like 2010. And of course, this is, like I said, not an exhaustive list. There is a large, large number of things that Julian Assange has revealed through WikiLeaks via, of course, various different whistleblowers and spies and other sorts of things like that, journalists, right, so on and so forth. But nonetheless, to read a little bit into the article, unfortunately, you can never really find mainstream articles about Julian Assange unless it's just a total hit piece. So this is from the LA Progressive. I'm not going to read the entire thing, but just, we're giving you guys a little bit of information as far as what's going on here. Preliminary, Assange appeal hearing set for August the 11th. The United States government has been given limited permission to appeal the district court's decision to block the extradition of Julian Assange from the UK to the US. Britain's High Court ruled that the US government could appeal on some but not all of their requested points. Now a preliminary hearing has been scheduled for August the 11th at the Royal Courts of Justice in London to argue the scope of that appeal and whether the U.S. government will be allowed to appeal on its other two proposed lines of argument. Assange is expected to attend in person. And of course, this is incredibly important because obviously we can't actually have somebody to charge, right, if we don't actually have them extradited over to our country. And not that it matters too much, because Britain is going to do with Assange what they're going to do. And there are numerous other nations that want to get their hands on Assange, including but not limited to Sweden and Australia and France, as well as, of course, the United States. So to a certain extent, it's almost a moot point, right? But obviously we're Americans, so we care about what's going on here in America. And I guess technically it's not here in America, so maybe I shouldn't word it like that. But obviously it involves the United States, right? Anyways. To be fair, I know a lot of people who listen to this are actually not in the United States. And we cover a whole wide scope of topics, but you guys get the idea anyways. Following that hearing, the High Court will schedule a date to hear full appeal arguments. The grounds for the appeal: the U.S. government set forth 5 lines of argument for its appeal of the extradition ruling, and 2 of them were denied. It will be allowed to argue that the judge misapplied Section 91 of the 2003 Extradition Act, which says someone can be extradited if the physical or mental condition of the person is such that it would be unjust or oppressive to extradite them. Can't be extradited if the physical or mental condition of the person is such that it would be unjust or oppressive to extradite him, and that the judge should have notified the prosecution that she found extradition would be unjust or oppressive, so that it could have provided, quote, assurances to the court, end quote, ahead of time. Finally, the High Court will allow the U.S. to put forth assurances in the appeal hearing. I should probably get a little bit better at reading this if I want to be, doing this 3 times a week and potentially as a career. Anyways, hopefully as this goes on, we'll get a little bit better with that. I apologize for that, friends. The High Court denied the U.S. government request to appeal on the grounds that the testimony of Professor Michael Kopelman should have been ruled inadmissible. Professor Kopelman is a psychiatrist who evaluated Assange and determined that he would be at risk of suicide if his extradition were ordered. The court also denied the U.S. government's request to argue that the judge erred in her overall assessment of evidence that Assange would be at risk of suicide. And of course, at this point, I would have to note that Assange would not only potentially be at risk of suicide because his mental state isn't well, but he would also be at risk of being suicided, I think, right? Obviously, with the deaths of not only, Jeffrey Epstein, but also John McAfee recently, under incredibly skeptical circumstances, or suspicious circumstances is the better word, probably. I'm skeptical of the circumstances is what I mean to say. And of course, that's not even an exhaustive list, because there's also some really weird things around the lead singer of Linkin Park and the famous CNN chef and journalist Anthony Bourdain. The point just being that people like Assange tend to involuntarily commit suicide when they create enemies out of the United States government. You know what I'm saying? So, there's, of course, a double risk of, quote, suicide in this particular case. But anyways, on August 11th, the High Court will hold a preliminary hearing for the parties to argue these last 2 grounds. Assange's fiancée, Stella Morris, explained that the U.S. government is attempting to do this with this move, or explained what the United States government is attempting to do with this move. Man, I am not doing well at reading tonight. Anyways, quote, any losing party, the U.S. in this case, is allowed to attempt to have different judges review the grounds that they have lost on. But the U.S. government attack on Dr. Kopelman is particularly vexatious. The U.S. government will try to rerun arguments that have already been settled by two different judges. It is the latest move by the U.S. government to try to game the British legal system. The U.S. government's handling of the case exposes the underlying nature of the prosecution against Julian, subverting the rules so that Julian's ability to defend himself is obstructed. Man, I don't know why I wanted to say obfuscated. It's not even a word. Ostracated, maybe. Turned into an ostrich. And undermined while he remains in prison for years and years, unconvicted and held on spurious charges. The process is the punishment. And let's recall that the United States government has done that before, right? The United States government did that to the Bundy family, specifically Ammon Bundy, who's currently running for governor of Idaho, and his brother Ryan Bundy, who both spent, I believe, 2 years, it was maybe even 2.5 years, in federal prison, despite never actually being convicted of the charge that they were in prison for, right? But they were considered to be a threat by the government, and so until the courts were actually done with them, they remained in custody, right? And of course, this happens outside of the country all the time. So even if it wasn't the case, that did happen here in the United States, obviously Assange would still have good reason to believe that it could happen because it happens in, quote, free countries all over the world all the time. Take, for example, the Tommy Robinson cases. And I say it that way because there has been many of them. Tommy Robinson is one of the most persecuted men in the first world. But at any rate, and I do mean, obviously it is important to make that distinction in the first world, right? Because there are people being executed in Russia and places like that. I get that. But nonetheless, the things that happened to Tommy Robinson are quite egregious. And he was obviously put into prison numerous times for various stints, sometimes as much as 6 months, sometimes as little as a couple of weeks. And he has almost never actually been found guilty of his charges. Every now and then he is actually found guilty of some of his charges. And more often than not, those charges do end up being trumped up even in themselves. But you do get the idea, right, of like there is this pattern of, quote, civilized, if you will, governments actually going after people who they disapprove of and punishing them via the process when they know they don't actually have a case to stick against them. And Britain is actually notorious for this. They did this to Count Dankula. They did this to whose real name is Mark Meechan. They did this to Sargon of Akkad, whose real name is Carl Benjamin. Both of those are YouTubers, by the way. They do this all the time. And the United States is getting quite proficient at it as well. Anyways, back to the quote. However much the prosecution plays to the gallery on August 11th in its efforts to attack the reputation of one of the most well-respected neuropsychiatrists in Britain, the real substance of the appeal will take place when the main appeal hearing will be heard in full later this year. But the scope of that hearing, 3 or 5 grounds, will be determined on the 11th of August, which of course is 2 days from today. And we're not going to read the rest of the article. We're going to end it there because there's a whole bunch of other stuff we want to talk about. But link is in the description if you guys want to actually start looking at that article for yourself. Want to go ahead and move on to our next article here real quick because obviously there's a lot to talk about and of time to talk about it. I'm going to hold off on the big one, the title one, for a little bit longer. That'll be our third one. Maybe keep you guys in a little bit of suspense about the secessionism that is growing here in the United States because it is growing. It is definitely growing. But I want to go ahead and talk about a couple of other things today, and we'll have obviously some stuff after it, but this will be the last thing we do before it, and that is there is an Amish farmer here currently facing off against the federal government for having the audacity to do organic farming and not actually get the FDA's approval. Now, obviously, one might say, well, why doesn't he just simply get the FDA's approval? And there's a lot of different reasons that one could give for that. However, in the case of an Amish farmer, I'm sure a lot of you guys could just guess for yourselves. He's not actually in the general community for the most part, right? He's separated in his own community, doing his own thing, typically selling to his own people, right? Kind of the same way how if you live in a rural community anywhere in what you might call the Midwest or even towards the Pacific Northwest, like I do in Idaho, right? You might know somebody who goes to a local farmer's market and sells their produce or potentially even sells meat that is not examined by the federal government, like is technically supposed to happen, right? It's no harm, no foul. It's just local people selling local products to other local people, right? But in this particular case, this Amish farmer is now having to face down the federal government, face down massive fines or jail time because of this particular incident with him not actually having the meat checked out by the federal government. So let's go ahead and read about that for a little bit here today. This article comes from Food Safety News, which, by the way, is not necessarily on the farmer's side. I originally got this from the Freedom Project, but I figured that in the name of basically integrity and honesty, I was going to not actually read you guys the Freedom Project article because it is very clearly on the farmer's side, as I am as well. And I want to provide you guys with sources that obviously look at either the other side or an unbiased side because, well, I'm here and I'm going to give you my side, right? So there's no need to hit you with the double whammy of one side, right? That creates an echo chamber. Chamber. Man, not only can I not read today, I can't talk. But anyways, so judge orders Amos Miller to pay $250,000 in fines within 30 days or risk jail time. This is from Dan Flynn, published July 23rd of 2021. And again, it is from Food Safety News. Link is in the description. Federal Judge Edward G. Smith today signed a 39-page order imposing sanctions on Amos Miller and Miller's Organic Farm, including a $250,000 fine and other penalties. Quote, in order to affect defendants... Hang on, let me get rid of this StreamYard thing. It's annoying me. Anyways, in order to affect defendants' future compliance by making them aware of the seriousness of their violations and the consequences for future violations, defendants are ordered to pay the United States within 30 days of the date of this entry of this order, and pursuant to written instructions that the United States will provide to defendants, a fine of $250,000 or face further monetary and other penalties, possibly including imprisonment of Amos Miller, end quote, the order says. So he needs to pay this $250,000 within 30 days or face potentially greater fines as well as imprisonment is basically what they are saying here today. And they're saying that the reason they want this harsh of a penalty is, and I'm going to go ahead and read the quote again, in order to affect defendants' future compliance by making them aware of the seriousness of their violations and the consequences of future violations, end quote. Not the end of the full quote, but end of their reasoning as to why they're pursuing him so harshly. Smith also ordered Miller to reimburse USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service, or FSIS, for its enforcement costs totaling $14,436.26, which effectively brings this up to just over $264,000 in fines. Miller has 60 days, to make the reimbursement, which is at least twice as long as he does have, I guess, to pay the $250,000 fine. So that's somewhat good, I guess. Anyways, further, Miller and Miller's Organic Farm are ordered not to slaughter any amenable animals in violation of the order, or a $25,000 fine per day will be immediately imposed by the court. So for each day that they continue to have their farm in operation, slaughtering meat, they will actually see $25,000 in fines, and of course, probably some other penalty coming down the pipeline as well. Excuse me. Miller is also to, quote, cease and desist all amenable meat and poultry-related retail operations, except to liquidate existing inventories unless and until Millers can demonstrate compliance with federal and Commonwealth laws. For each day that Millers conduct such retail operations in violation of laws and without a Commonwealth of Pennsylvania license, defendants shall be ordered to pay a fine of $1,500, end quote. The order continues. With 14 days, probably means within 14 days, Miller must also place statements pre-approved by the FSIS on his websites, quote, explaining to his members and customers that A, the court has ruled that Miller has violated the court's injunction order and consent decree, quote, and this is a quote within the quote, by the way, for each day after 14 days following the entry of this order and until FSIS verifies that Miller has liquidated its existing inventory of amenable products, that such a statement does not appear on Miller's websites, its associates' websites, and Miller's Facebook page, defendants, shall be ordered to pay a fine of $1,500, end quote, within the quote, the order adds. The court on June 16, 2021, found Miller in contempt of the injunction order and consent decree following an in-person, show cause hearing. Miller has shown to have, quote, had knowledge of those orders and their contents, end quote, and that he disobeyed the orders. The current action against Miller goes back 5 years when FSIS asked the court to enforce a USDA subpoena that was brought against Miller for his denial of access to his records and his meat poultry facilities. Later, in two 2017 letters, FSIS warned Miller and Miller's Organic Farm that they were still violating federal inspection, labeling, and FSIS right of access requirements in the Federal Meat Inspection Act. With the 2019 injunction order, the court granted summary judgment in favor of the United States and entered the requested permanent injunctive relief, enjoining defendants from committing continuing violations of the acts. Among the court's findings were these. A. Amos Miller and his wife owned and operated Miller's, an incorporated business located at 648 Mill Creek School Road, Birdenham, Pennsylvania. B. At its farm sites, Miller's has been slaughtering livestock or poultry and then preparing, processing, storing, and or distributing meat, food products, and poultry products. C. Miller sold its meat, food products, and poultry products that are subject to the acts known as amenable products for commercial purposes and for human consumption to consumers in Pennsylvania and throughout the United States. D. Federal inspection is required at such an establishment that slaughters livestock or poultry and then prepares or processes amenable meat, food products, or poultry products that are capable of use as human food for interstate or foreign commerce, unless the establishment qualifies for an exemption from federal inspection. And E. Miller's had been operating its meat and poultry business without a USDA FSIS federal grant of inspection, and with rare exception, without taking its livestock and poultry for slaughter and processing to any federally inspected facility. And finally, F. Defendants had not yet changed Miller's business model to attempt to qualify for an exemption from federal inspection under the acts for any of their questions. And that is also the end of the article. So the long and short of it is this farmer, who is a Amish farmer in Pennsylvania and an organic meat farmer named Amos Miller, is being fined and will potentially be imprisoned for his refusal to comply with federal inspection guidelines that, of course, come from the FDA, ultimately, right, if you go all the way up, but particularly these FSIS documents on what they call the amenable food products, right? And some may question, why is this something that I think is important, right? Some may wonder, well, do you think that our meat shouldn't be inspected, for example? And the answer to that question is definitely not by the federal government. Perhaps we could have state governments or even city governments do something along those lines, something more localized, potentially. I wouldn't have a problem with. But I certainly have a problem with the federal government going into a local man's business or place of business and telling him what it is that he can and cannot do. And I have a whole litany of reasons for that. Obviously, I'm not going to be super familiar with the ins and outs of the meat industry, but I can tell you, as somebody who's worked in food service for most of my working life, which of course is only 6 years now, but it is still most of my working life. And by food service, I do mean restaurants, just to be clear, restaurants and fast food, right? I can say from personal experience that there is a lot of absolutely ridiculous laws that come straight from the federal government that if you do not comply with can absolutely destroy your business if you are somebody who doesn't make a whole lot of money, potentially like a struggling business or a small business, right? For example, I've had instances where because you have to have your food 6 inches above the ground, right? Has to be exactly 6 inches. And that's very strictly enforced to the point where a health inspector will show up, see that you have food that is not touching the ground, that is 3 or 4 inches above the ground, and you get some absolutely ridiculous fine for it, right? I'm sorry, that's stupid, in my opinion. And that comes from some idiot in Washington who's probably never had anything to do either with the medical field or the food industry in his entire life, right? Who is either legislating or much more likely dictating, because he's a part of some bureaucracy, how it is that people on the local level are going to have to run their businesses. And I don't approve of that in any way, shape, or form. And I think this is a good example as to why I don't approve of that, right? This is absolutely ridiculous. This man is doing nothing more than farming his food organically. And the federal government has to go ahead and get its thumb involved, right? Get its nose involved, rather. Man, what is I didn't even have that saying right at all. But get its nose in everybody's business is the point, right? And it's just ridiculous. It's just an example of the federal government having overreach that absolutely does not constitutionally belong to it. It constitutionally, at best, belongs to localized governments at the state or even more local level. And you could even argue that it could go to the private level, though there is arguments against that. And to be fair, they're not bad arguments, right? Like meat industries in the early 20th century were quite disgusting. So to have some level of oversight is definitely not a bad thing. But it absolutely makes sense for it to be done by people, number one, within the industry, and number two, and this is, I think, the important aspect, localized, at least to the state level, if not to the county or city level. But nonetheless, I digress with that. Let's go ahead and get to the big article for today. The one that you probably clicked on this video for, right? And that is secessionist sentiment in the United States is on the rise. I have titled this particular segment here, Will We See the Nation Dissolve? Will we see a national breakup? National divorce? Is it actually going to happen today? Not today as in this day, right? But today as in within our lifetime, within this generation, right? In the era in which we live, right? By the way, I do see from the live chat a correction of something I said earlier. NOAA is an American institution, not a UN institution. So good correction for the record there. But at any rate, now for some brief background on this particular question, this is not something that is coming out of left field by any stretch of the imagination, though to you it may seem like it is coming out of left field. And I don't say that to say anybody here isn't keeping up or to insult anybody, right? But I say that to say if you don't know where to look, this might be something that is just completely and totally shocking to you, right? But really, there has been heavy secessionist sentiment on the rise in the United States since about the 2011 year and the 2012 presidential election cycle. And really, you could push it back to the Tea Party revolution and the Occupy revolution itself, both of which were around 2010, 2012 era, right? And had each of their respective sides, Tea Party being right-wing, Occupy being left-wing, right? Both of these different groups eventually started harboring some people with what we might consider to be radical beliefs. Those beliefs are no longer radical, meaning that they're no longer, at least, hang on, they are still, I guess, radical because they still aim to upend the system in a radical way. But they are certainly no longer abnormal, right? They've definitely taken hold on either side. And by the way, I'm not saying anything against either of these positions or for either of these positions. I'm just simply reporting on what I think is the facts, right? But nonetheless, this really started rising around that Tea Party revolution, quote unquote. And it got to the point to where in 2012, people in Texas, all the way up to high-ranking government officials like Governor Rick Perry and Congressman Ron Paul, were actually actively contemplating the question of secession, specifically because of a lot of the gun control stuff that was being talked about, not only in the Obama administration, but then, especially, right, after the Sandy Hook massacre in December of 2012, which just kickstarted all of this stuff to an even worse extent, right? And then it continued on, and it started to get a little bit more legitimized when you started to see people who were more intellectual. For example, not to say Ron Paul is not an intellectual, but he's in the political field, right? So people might consider him to be more of a politician than an intellectual. But nonetheless, like, for example, people like Matt Walsh, right? And other conservative commentators, as well as liberal commentators, who started actually actively asking the question, hey, maybe might it be a good idea for the United States to start considering something like a national breakup? This got another push from the left side when Donald Trump got elected, because a lot of people in California were saying, hey, might it be a good idea? It doesn't look like we have the same values as the people who want to elect this man as their president. Might it be a good idea for California to secede? Of course, then you have the rise of groups that we might consider to be extreme. I personally wouldn't consider the Proud Boys to be extreme, but that is one of these groups. Other groups I would consider to be extreme, like Antifa and BLM, but nonetheless, these groups got a lot of power behind them. They started rising up. They got a lot more violent. And then we had the big thing that really blew this up to the point of where now I don't think we will ever stop talking about it until something big happens. And I will talk about what I think that is in a moment. And that is just 2020 in general, right? Everything that happened in 2020. The election cycle, the coronavirus, the George Floyd riots, the mass takedown of statues and logos and stuff like that. The impeachment, the second impeachment, mask mandates and lockdowns that were related to coronavirus, so many other things. And directly following the election, almost every single commentator in the country was talking in some way, shape, or form, whether they were refuting it or talking for it or just considering it, talking in some way, shape, or form about the subjects of secession and national breakup, right? Chad Prather is running for governor of Texas now, not on the platform of Texas secession, but because of a bunch of stuff that he said about Texas secession, right? That's what fueled, in other words, his recent run for the Republican Party nomination for governor in Texas, right? Which we'll, of course, see whether or not that occurs, meaning he gets nominated and all that in 2022. By the way, Prather for governor of Texas 2022, Bundy for governor of Idaho 2022, and Elder for governor of California 2021. Anyways, and not only is this now in the intellectual fields and on the fringe fields and in the militia fields, but now we actually have evidence that it has infiltrated even the lay fields, if you will, that we are actually seeing United States citizens who are not politicians, who are not intellectuals, who are not pundits, who are not journalists, start to actually acknowledge that not only is secession a possible thing, but that it might be a good thing for whatever it is that they believe, right? Which is obviously a huge change from where we were a couple of years back, and especially a decade back, right? But to get right into the article so that I have some evidence to back up what I'm saying for you guys. This is from OregonLive.com. And by the way, one thing I would note is you can see the sentiment of people who don't like their fellow countrymen rising in both left and right wing center. What would you call that? Man, I'm losing all the words that I have in my head today, but nonetheless, just places where a lot of these people congregate, right? A lot of people on the coasts find the middle to be flyover country, to be full of dumb brutes, Neanderthals, right? As they often say, that's actually the inspiration for my logo, right? Because they were saying that long before Biden was saying anything. And people in predominantly right-wing areas very much have disdain for people on the West Coast. They find them to be elitist. They find them to be debaucherous. They typically don't want them coming into their state. I've even heard people talk about potentially having anti-transient laws the same way we have anti-immigration laws, right? And I even fully support those, by the way. But nonetheless, and I don't mean anti-transient laws in the sense that you can't have transients. I mean anti-transient laws in the sense that you have to like assimilate to the culture in order to be considered a citizen of the state, the same way we do with immigration. But at any rate, all this stuff is dramatically on the rise if you just go around and ask people questions, right? And I mean just lay people, right? Not going to your local news station or anything like that. But nonetheless, so support for secession dramatically rises in the U.S., including on the West Coast among Democrats, poll finds. This is published July the 19th, 2011. And again, this is from Oregon Live. It's not originally from Oregon Live, though. It's originally from the Oregonian, published by a man named Douglas Perry. But nonetheless, give you guys, some idea of who it is who actually wrote this. Give credit where credit is due. The long shot grassroots effort to move Oregon's rural eastern and southern counties into Idaho has scored national attention in recent months. But a new survey suggests that a lot of Oregonians, and this is, of course, just one of the smaller versions of it, right? But there's numerous different secessionist movements to try and move different states, to break up the country, to all this different kind of stuff, right? So, obviously, bear with us for talking through this for a moment, right? But anyways, the long shot grassroots effort to move Oregon's rural eastern and southern counties into Idaho has scored national attention in recent months. But a new survey suggests that a lot of Oregonians have grander secession ideas, at least when a pollster brings up the possibility. The democracy monitoring academic initiative Brightline Watch, using the survey firm YouGov, asked 2,750 Americans last month whether they'd support a prospective new union derived from their states and others splitting off from the U.S. For poll respondents along the West Coast, that new nation would be made up of California, Washington, Oregon, Hawaii, and Alaska. And fat chance that Alaska joins that kind of a coalition, by the way, because Alaska is incredibly conservative in their political beliefs, specifically libertarian conservative, whereas the rest of those four states are damn near communist. But nonetheless, you guys obviously get the idea that we have being postulated here. The support for such a Pacific Coast nation stands at 39%, according to the poll. That is greater, my friends, than a third. That is nearly half of the people who they asked. It's 11% away from it, right? It's not quite as nearly as it could be, but it's pretty close. Closer to half than it is to a fourth. Over a third by 6%. It's not a small amount of people, right? Anyways, the support for such a Pacific Coast nation stands at 39% overall, according to the poll, with 47% of Democrats, 33% of independents, and 27% of Republicans saying that they back secession from the United States and the creation of an independent Cali, Washington, Oregon, Hawaii, Alaska union, which might be a little bit counterintuitive to most people. People might think that independents and Republicans might be more likely, but of course, it is entirely possible that a lot of people who are in these demographic groups actually are supportive of something like secession, just not in this particular kind of a union. But anyways, enthusiasm for the idea of the U.S. splitting apart is most pronounced in the American South, where lies about the 2020, and by the way, this is the article's opinion itself, just so you guys know, but nonetheless, where lies about the 2020 presidential election being stolen are more commonly accepted as true than in other parts of the country. For this survey's purposes, a new southern nation would be stitched together from Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, South and North Carolina, Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. So basically, the former Confederacy add Kentucky. But at any rate, let's go ahead and get to what the poll had to say. 44% of Southerners said they wanted their region to break off on its own. 44%. So at that point, you're now closer to half than you are to a third, right? 44% of Southerners said they wanted their region to break off on its own. That is a lot of people saying, yeah, no, I think that we should be our own independent nation. The United States experiment has run its course. We need to be independent. We need to worry about our own. We are our own people. Whatever it is the reason, right? Whatever the reason is, rather, that these people actually believe in this sort of thing. The fact is they do, right? And in pretty large numbers. Minority, but large minority, like very large minority. I'm not saying that, by the way, as a necessarily negative thing. I'll get to my opinions on this in the end. I just hope you guys understand the gravity of this. Like, this is not fringe, right? Like, people are actually actively considering this, and we may live to see it. We may not, of course. Who knows? It's probably less likely than it is likely, all things considered. But the sentiment is there. It's there amongst left-wingers and right-wingers. It's there amongst Southerners and West Coasters and even New Englanders. It's there amongst black people, white people, religious people, atheists. It's there amongst basically everybody at this point. There's pretty solid reason for that. But again, I'll get to my own thoughts in a moment. 44% of Southerners said they wanted their region to break off on its own, with 66% of Republicans, 50% of independents, and 20% of Democrats saying they favor the move. The exact opposite, of course, of what we saw in the case of that West Coast Union. The U.S. Northeast, meanwhile, saw 34% of respondents support for secession. 34% of people in New England, right? Or the New England area, at least. The Northeast is, I guess, a greater area than strictly New England. That is still over a third. Just barely, don't get me wrong. But it's a large minority of people. In the mountain region, which is Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico, 32% said they were in favor of creating their own landlocked country, which might be initially shocking to people if you live here. But again, I think part of the reason for the low numbers there has to do probably with the way that everything is set up. Like, for example, I don't imagine a lot of Idahoans are probably down with having a landlocked country that incorporates groups like New Mexico and Nevada, right? But I'll be willing to bet that if you switched those borders around a little bit, you might get that number to go up. Now, I say that anecdotally, but I do say that as somebody who lives in the state of Idaho. But anyways. And in the heartland, Michigan, Ohio, West Virginia, Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, Iowa, Missouri, North and South Dakota, Kansas, and Nebraska, the support for the U.S. breakup stands at 30%. My friends, if you take that for what it is worth, the different groups that they ended up looking at, of which there are 5, the lowest that the support for secession and national breakup, the lowest amount of support demographically that there was for national secession and breakup was 30%. And it was for people who wanted to set up a heartland nation. Heartland nation would be filled, I'm not going to go through the list again, but with these states here, if you're looking at the screen. That was the lowest. The highest was 44%, and that was in the South. This is not a fringe thing to talk about anymore. This is not something that is just kept by the wayside. This is something that might actually, we have an election cycle coming up in 2022, right? People are obviously already announcing they're running for it. Just had Ammon Bundy on for the Idaho gubernatorial election. Shameless plug. This might come up in this election cycle. I'm not 100% sure about that. Certainly it'll come in the election cycles within this decade. Absolutely. But it's possible we could have people at least answering questions about this. This election cycle, 30% is the smallest of any of the 5 demographics that they actually ended up surveying. 30% is the smallest, 44% again the highest. All minorities, but all very large minorities. To put that in perspective for you, 30% is a larger number than the number of non-religious people in the United States, which is 23%, than the number of Hispanic people in the United States, which is 22%, than the number of Black people in the United States, which is 13%, than the number of Catholics in the United States, which I don't know the exact numbers of, but I know is something around the lines of a third of the general Christian demographic, which is considered to be 68%. So give or take some rough numbers, because I have to guesstimate it exactly. I'm not getting it, the exact number. That would put you somewhere around, I think, 23%, right? Greater than all of those groups. 30% is. Quick question. How many Catholics do you know? Or Black people do you know? Or Hispanic people do you know? Or non-religious people do you know? Because it's more likely you know somebody who supports secession than any of those groups. And I highly doubt there is anybody listening to this podcast who does not know at least one person in each of those groups who is not in any of the other groups. That is how mainstream, if you will, this issue has become, according to this recent evidence. Anyways, Bright Line Watch, which tracks threats to democratic practices in the U.S., called secession fever in the country. 37%. I cannot talk. 37% of respondents overall said they support it. Quote, arrestingly high. Arrestingly high is what they say. That's an interesting adjective to use, I think. The survey report does offer the important caveat that the result, quote, reflects initial reactions by respondents about an issue that they are unlikely to have considered carefully, end quote. That is, replies to the secessionist question might be knee-jerk and emotional, and thus the responses aren't necessarily decisions they would make if faced with a formal secession vote following an extensive campaign on the issue. I actually disagree with what the survey is noting there. I think that it is much more likely that if you have concerted campaigns for this thing, people get caught up in the fervor and start to believe things that they don't actually believe. And I put air quotes in front of that first believe, but I know you guys can't see me, so I gotta obviously explain that to you, right? I think a perfect example of this is like the Cherokee Nation in the American Civil War, right? Overwhelmingly voted to support the Confederacy initially, overwhelmingly, right? Because they got caught up in the fervor. And it was not close. It was every one of the chiefs. It was well over 2/3 of the population, right? The Cherokee Nation was on board with the Confederacy, hook, line, and sinker. And give it a couple of months, literally a couple of months, and it got to about a 50-50 split. Most people still supported the Confederacy and the Cherokee Nation, but a lot of people, including the Cherokee chief John Ross, didn't actually support it any longer. They got caught up in the fervor, but as it turned out, upon greater reflection after the campaigns were over, they didn't really support this idea of a Southern Confederacy, right? So, and you can look at that in tons of other examples too, like votes for Scottish independence, votes for Brexit, so on and so forth, right? In the heat of the moment, meaning the campaign, not in a question that you have a knee-jerk reaction to, but in the middle of the campaign when people are actually voting for this stuff, tensions are high and emotions are flared, right? And so I think it's the exact opposite of what these guys are actually talking about. But anyways, there's also the likelihood that some poll respondents would have reached a different conclusion on secession if Bright Line Watch had configured the possible new nations differently, which of course I was talking about earlier. For example, a lot of Alaskans presently in a reliably Republican state might prefer to go into the Purple Mountain Nation rather than the West Coast Nation, which would be politically dominated by liberal California. And of course, that is not just California, right? Also, Hawaii is very liberal. And at least in the more western portions of the states, like Vancouver and Portland and Seattle, Oregon and Washington are also quite liberal. But at any rate, the trend, however, is unmistakable, and I completely agree with that. Brightline Watch asked the same question about secession back in January of this year. Okay, the overall support for a U.S. breakup then came in at 29%, 8 percentage points lower than it now stands. And if you were to look at numbers of this a decade back, I would be willing to bet quite strongly. And in fact, I'd be willing to bet quite a lot of money that the number probably would be less than 15%. I'd almost guarantee it. I wouldn't even be surprised if it was less than 10%. Right? But my friends, we are at that point in history, right? Probably closer now to civil war and secession than we have ever been since the pre-American Civil War days, or antebellum days, as they're commonly called. And that doesn't mean either of those things will happen, but it does mean there is an unmistakable trend going on in the United States, as this article actually points out. And by the way, I would just say that I don't even necessarily think it's a bad trend. I have said numerous times before, and I'll say again, that national divorce or breakup, or whatever you want to call it, could be the only peaceful option left for the United States. In other words, I think the tensions have gotten so high in America. People are so dissatisfied with their fellow countrymen that it might be we peacefully dissolve this union and become a collection of allied nations that share this particular landmass known as North America, or we go into bloody civil war and tyrannical dictatorship. Like that literally might be our options. And I've said that even before we had the 2020 election cycle, after we had a mass amount of violence around Antifa and the reaction to that violence by groups like Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, right? And to be fair, I've even believed it before then. There are people, some of them watching this video, who can confirm that I've talked about this kind of stuff all the way back to when I was 14 and 15 years old. Because the thing is, if you're actually paying attention, it's kind of obvious, right? Of course, this kind of stuff is going to come up. Like, we are a very divided, dissatisfied, disillusioned country, and a lot of people barely even consider themselves American anymore. I, for one, am quite the patriot. I, for one, am quite the nationalist. I, for one, am quite the constitutionalist. I, for one, appreciate, right, the United States of America and what it stood for and what that flag stands for and the great experiment that this country is, right? But I also recognize, I think, that we are at that point in history, right? And it's not just the United States, by the way. The European Union is experiencing this same sentiment. And even down at the national levels, Spain and the United Kingdom and other areas of the continent known as Europe are also experiencing this. Iraq and Syria are experiencing this. China and India are having serious problems with this. Like, there is a massive, massive wave of nationalism and localism going all across the world right now. And the United States has definitely been bit by the bug. And I don't know that it's necessarily a bad thing. If it gets us out of violent dictatorship from either side, if it gets us out of some level of violent insurrection or civil war, if it allows each side to be happy and properly preserve their political customs, their cultural customs, their philosophical and religious customs, right? I mean, then I'm for it. I'm for it. And you know what? We can each, if you want to say, well, I consider myself an American. Well, I do too. All right. We can each consider ourselves to be inheritors of the American tradition. It's not like that hasn't happened in the past, but I don't think it's a bad idea. I don't think it's a bad idea. I mean, I don't know what else to say about that. And I'm not even necessarily saying it's a great idea either. Obviously, I would prefer if the nation stayed together. But we are at this point in history. We have to honestly consider these things. And if it is actually as I say, and let me even put that, in a way that is more accurate as to how I feel. If it is actually as I fear, then this is the better of the two options. Because civil war is brutal. It's brutal. And that's really all I can say about that in particular. There's a couple things I want to talk about very briefly. We are hitting our hour, but there's a couple of other things that I do think need to be addressed. So we are definitely going to address them. The first thing is Pastor Tony Spell, who you guys may remember, will not back down. For those of you who don't recall, we've done reports on him before, and there's an Unapologetics episode where we interviewed him, actually. We might get him again for another interview here on the Watchdog. Pastor Tony Spell is a Oneness Pentecostal pastor in central Louisiana. Central is actually the name of the town. It's not like the center of the state. Who has defied COVID mandates and lockdowns since day one, who has accurately predicted where this was going since day one, and who has said that we believe that under the First Amendment of the Constitution, namely the freedom to assemble peaceably and the freedom to practice our religion, that we have every right to tell the federal government, no, we will continue to meet. We will not have mandated vaccinations in order to meet. We will not have mandated masks in order to meet. We will not have mandated social distancing in order to meet. And we will not lock down our church. This was before, not that I'm saying there's anything wrong with these people. Obviously, I support them. But this was well before James Coates in Canada, well before Arthur Pawlowski in Canada, well before Tim Remington, even here in Idaho. Well before John MacArthur down in California, right? Tony Spell is the original. He's the OG as far as the pastor saying we're not going to shut down the church, right? And he has said recently that he is not going to comply with Louisiana's mandates when they come in again. Personally, I think Pastor Tony Spell should use his platform that he has right now to potentially run for governor of Louisiana. Potentially that maybe he sees himself as, and I guess he is a pastor, right? So, maybe he doesn't want to abandon his flock, things of that nature. I certainly would understand those sorts of things. But I almost wonder if it might be a good idea for him to challenge John Bel Edwards at the governor's seat level in this next 2022 election cycle. But nonetheless, Pastor Tony Spell says his church will once again defy COVID mandates. And this was published August 3rd, 2021. Again, like all the articles, link is in the description if you want to read for yourself. Let's go ahead and get right into this. Pastor Tony Spell, who is facing multiple charges for bucking coronavirus restrictions, is pledging to dismiss Louisiana's new mask mandate. Quote, "We will never comply," end quote, Spell told Newsweek in an email. Quote, "Everything that Governor Edwards is doing is unlawful and unconstitutional. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. The shutdowns are unlawful, as well as the mask mandate and employer-forced vaccinations. This is still America, even though our politicians do not acknowledge it," end quote. Louisiana Governor John Bel Edwards announced Monday he was reinstating a statewide mask mandate. By the way, this was Monday, August the 2nd, I believe. Yeah, August the 2nd. Anyways, Louisiana Governor John Bel Edwards announced Monday he was reinstating a statewide mask mandate for indoor settings. The requirement applies to all residents, regardless of whether they have been inoculated against the virus. So in other words, not only are we going to force you to take this experimental drug, but also we're going to take away your freedoms anyways. So, you better just deal with it because the coronarchy is here to stay, my friend. And I'm obviously saying that tongue in cheek. Don't actually deal with it. Fight it. But that's what the government wants you to do, is deal with it. That's what the coronarchy wants you to do. The coronarchists, I should say. Right. Quote, the data in Louisiana clearly points to the severity of our situation and the urgency to act now, end quote, Dr. Joseph Cantor, the state's health officer, said in a statement. Louisiana experienced a 7-day average of 4,119 new coronavirus cases as of Sunday, according to data from Johns Hopkins University, a significant increase from a daily average of 2,414 new cases the week prior. The state is currently experiencing an average of 99 cases per 100,000 residents per day, the most of any area in the county, according to the New York Times. I think that is supposed to say country. I think that might be a miswriting on the part of the writer, which, by the way, does my heart so much joy, considering how many times I've biffed reading these articles and even just speaking basic English. It's nice to know that the professional journalists are not doing very much better. But anyways, I'm obviously saying that tongue in cheek. He's probably much better at this than I am. At any rate, Spell, the pastor at Life Tabernacle Church in Baton Rouge, vowed to defy any future coronavirus mandates or shutdowns ahead of Edwards' order on masking. I think that might be inaccurate. I think he is in Central and not in Baton Rouge. But I might be wrong about that. Maybe somebody can check it if they want to. If anybody wants to play fact checker, look up if Tony Spell is in Central or Baton Rouge. It's not actually a big deal. I'm just curious now. But at any rate, quote, we are not the ones who are troubling our cities. It's the devil troubling us, end quote, Spell said in a YouTube video on July the 30th. Quote, it's the wicked, perverse government troubling us because we refuse to mask, we refuse to vax, or we refuse to quit going to church, or we refuse to quit shaking hands and baptizing over 1,000 people, end quote. And by the way, that's not an exaggeration. Tony Spell has a pretty massive church that has only grown larger since he has experienced government persecutions, which, by the way, is also not an exaggeration. Definitely check out my interview with Pastor Tony Spell if you think that it is, or any of the previous watchdogs that I've talked about on it, but I don't have time to go through all of that here today. Spell was arrested and charged last year with 6 misdemeanors for violating Edwards' restrictions on crowd sizes by holding large maskless church services in the early days of the pandemic. Prosecutors offered Spell a plea deal earlier this year, offering to drop 5 of the charges if he pleaded no contest to one of the misdemeanor charges. During a hearing last September, Spell was not allowed in court because he wouldn't wear a face covering, something which, of course, is becoming common. That happened to Ammon Bundy here in Idaho for a different charge, and it's happening all across the country, of course, because, in order to fight these mask mandates, you have to follow a mask mandate, and obviously people are pointing out the inherent hypocrisy in that. But anyways, or I guess problem, it might not be technically hypocrisy, but whatever. Back to the article. In April, the pastor was charged for allegedly backing a church bus toward a coronavirus protester. That did not happen, by the way. Again, check out my interview with Tony Spell if you have questions. That is actually one of the examples of Tony Spell being persecuted by the Louisiana government. The Central Police Department, see, this says Central. Anyways, the Central Police Department said Spell was issued an arrest warrant for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, which is a totally trumped-up charge, and there is literally video evidence to verify that. When asked if he was concerned about facing additional charges for defying the latest mask mandate, Spell told Newsweek, quote, we are facing up to 18 years in prison. Yes, that is true. You heard that correctly. Tony Spell is facing up to 18 years in prison for having the audacity to preach in his church. Okay? But anyways, we're facing up to 18 years in prison, so nothing they can do will hurt more than that. We continue to stand for religious and civil liberties. However, it is concerning knowing the government will stop at nothing to force compliance, end quote. And that's the end of the article there. Again, Pastor Tony Spell is saying he will not comply with coronavirus restrictions. And I want to say that we here at the Watchdog throw full support behind Pastor Spell And we're going to move on immediately to the next article for sake of time. The CIA is currently in the Middle East for some reason. Nobody really knows why quite yet, but there's a lot of official reasons that are given, of course, as well as some people's speculation. But nonetheless, this is from the Jerusalem Post, written by Lahav Harkov. CIA head set to arrive in Israel, meaning the head of the CIA. How will the U.S. tackle Iran? Iran is at the top of CIA Director Bill Burns' agenda for his Israel visit as Iran nuclear deal negotiations continue to stall. Not going to read the whole article for sake of time, but it is in the description if you're interested. CIA Director Bill Burns was set to arrive in Israel on Tuesday amid reports that the U.S. is considering alternative ways to get Iran to stop advancing its nuclear program as negotiations. What happened there? Sorry, just totally refreshed on me for no reason. As negotiations to return to the 25th, I just gotta have to restart that. CIA Director Bill Burns was set to arrive in Israel on Tuesday amid reports that the U.S. is considering alternative ways to get Iran to stop advancing its nuclear program as negotiations to return to the 2015 Iran deal stall. One option the U.S. is weighing is limited sanctions relief in exchange for Iran freezing its uranium enrichment, Bloomberg reported. However, the U.S. is still officially calling for a return to the nuclear agreement with follow-on negotiations to make it longer and stronger, which, of course, I thoroughly oppose, and I think any sane, rational human being should thoroughly oppose giving an Islamic dictatorship the right to have nuclear capabilities. I mean, I don't know. I just think it might be a problem, but whatever. Now, of course, you could ask the question, should we be getting involved in that sort of thing? It's not our business. Don't we believe in national sovereignty? All that kinds of stuff. And you're 100% right about that. The thing is, Iran is a threat to the United States. So in interest of our national sovereignty, we should tell them, sorry, we're not going to let you do this. Tough luck. Our army's bigger than yours. Okay? Maybe you shouldn't be making threats. And by the way, we should also lay off of Israel and allow them to deal with their own national security threat, which also happens to be Iran. Isn't that great? Kill two birds with one stone. Actually, one bird with two stones, if you think about it. But anyways, in recent months, Iran began to enrich uranium to 60%, develop uranium metal, and block International Atomic Energy Agency access to nuclear sites. U.S. and European officials are concerned that Iran's violation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, agreement will become so advanced that it will make the JCPOA deal irrelevant. Israel has long argued that Iran has already reached that point. Last week, Defense Minister Benny Gantz said the Islamic Republic was potentially 10 weeks from a bomb. And personally, if I were the state of Israel, I would absolutely just tell the international community, the United States, take a hike. These guys are an existential threat to our existence as a nation. And we're not your vassal. We're not your puppet. We're not your 51st state. So I'm going to take them out. And on top of that, the United States should be totally cool with this because Iran is an existential threat to our existence as well. You might say, hey, Iran doesn't have the capability to take out the United States. CJ, what are you talking about? They got alliances. Those alliances include but are not limited to Russia, North Korea, and China. I'm sorry, friends. I personally would like to avoid World War III, even if we are on the winning side. Just saying. We're going to go ahead and end the reading of this particular article here. No, we're not. Sorry, I thought I read more than I did. Yeah, sorry. I was looking at what I thought I had already read. There's a couple more paragraphs we're going to read here, and then we're going to move on because I want to, for the sake of time, share with you guys a couple other things. Iran is at the top of Burns' agenda for his Israel visit this week. He's expected to meet with Prime Minister Naftali Bennett on Wednesday. His spokesman confirmed following initial reports by Axios. Burns is also set to meet with new Mossad director David Barnea. He will also reportedly meet with Palestinian Authority intelligence chief Majed Faraj in Ramallah, as well as Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, otherwise known as the PA, by the way. The U.S. Embassy in Israel declined to comment. In 6 rounds of indirect talks between the U.S. and Iran to rejoin the JCPOA, U.S. President Joe Biden's administration was unable to leverage the maximum pressure sanctions his predecessor, former President Donald Trump, imposed on Iran to bring about concessions. And of course, part of that is because he is a weak, sniveling, semi-sapient bowl of pudding who probably is not actually the president of the United States, meaning that he is just a figurehead, a ceremonial figure, if you will. But that is, I guess, neither here nor there. So what exactly is the CIA doing in this region? Well, they are at least talking a little bit about the Iranian nuclear deal. But of course, as you saw indicated there, they're also going to be talking a little bit about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. How do we know that? Not because this article said anything about it, but because this article did at least tell us that he was going to go meet with the Palestinian president, quote unquote. Obviously, you have to have a country to be a president, but, you know, who cares about details? So what's up? What's going on here? Obviously, we don't have any way to really solidly know, and we don't want to speculate too strongly because we don't have a lot of the details. Obviously, link is in the description if you guys want to read the entire article for yourselves. But I think we are probably seeing Biden's attempt to, or at least the Biden administration's attempt to, pick up where Trump left off, not only in Israeli-Arab peace, but specifically in Israeli-Palestinian peace. Let's remind everybody that Trump and Jared Kushner did publish a Israeli-Palestinian peace plan that was essentially a doctored version of the 1999 Vatican plan that was published by the Vatican and Shimon Peres, where they essentially gave most of Judea and Samaria, commonly known as the West Bank, to Palestine, as well as East Jerusalem for a capital, Israel proper, the Golan Heights, and a few settlements in Judea and Samaria to Israel, as well as West Jerusalem for their capital, and suggested internationalization of the old city. And a way that was going to actually take place was between a joint custodianship between Israel and the current custodian, Jordan. My guess is that Biden, or at least the Biden administration, and specifically CIA Director Bill Burns, are basically going to be in the area to try and pick up where Trump left off there and push forward their agenda, obviously using the pieces that Trump has already put into play, such as this published peace plan, the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem, and the Abraham Accords. I won't say anything more than that because I don't know anything more than that, and I don't want to speculate any farther than that. But that is my suspicion. That is what I would suspect. And with that, I think we'll go ahead and jump to the next article. This is sort of the rapid fire section of the episode, if you will, right? Next section, ecumenism continues to rise globally. Here we see an example because we're, of course, usually focused on big countries like Israel, like China, like the United States, like Canada, but it's happening everywhere across the country. And here we see, across the world. And here we see an example of the ecumenical movement stretching to the Philippines. Now, of course, the ecumenical movement is growing in a version that is greater than just quote Christian links to perennialism, right? But obviously we don't have completion of the ecumenical movement yet, so how can we get to a perennial movement? But nonetheless, Philippine Catholic Church inks documents with Nationalist Church for reconciliation and common baptism. This comes from Angelus News, but actually originally was published by the Catholic News Agency. Again, Philippine Catholic Church inks document with Nationalist Church for reconciliation and common baptism. We actually will read this whole article because it is very short. Catholic Church leaders in the Philippines signed documents with the Iglesia Filipina Independiente, or IFI, or Philippine Independent Church, quote, for more ecumenical cooperation amidst diversity, end quote. So already we have to stop because This is something that should very much concern you, regardless of if you are a believer or not, okay? Because what ecumenism means is all of the different denominations and religious bodies in the country, and in this case, in the world, getting together, sharing their power with each other, essentially having a global reaching divine mandate dictating over people's lives. I don't think I need to speculate as to all of the different ways that could go wrong. You think the Inquisition was bad? Imagine all of the bishops supporting it all across the world with a divine mandate. You ain't seen nothing like the Inquisitions. You think I'm exaggerating, friends, but you do not understand the power behind the ecumenical movement if it ends up being successful. If all of the world's denominations operate as one body, and then if they end up moving that even further and forming, as they plan to do, a United Nations of religions, friends, we will see the most powerful international body that has ever existed, bar none. It had put the European Union, the League of Nations, the Concert of Europe, the United Nations, World Health Organization, World Trade Organization, G20, G7, all of those groups combined to shame, to absolute shame. There is no power like divine mandate. And if you've got global divine mandate from all of the churches, or even worse in the perennialist case, all of the world's faiths, that is a problem. And I don't think I need to reference the fact that this kind of stuff is talked about in the book of Revelations to share with you that that's a problem. I think it is talked about in the book of Revelations. I think we are witnessing evidence that the Bible is true. That's why I start this show saying, here to tell you we are in biblical times. But even if you are not a believer, even if you find yourself to be a skeptic, let me say this should concern you. All of the New World Order garbage that the conspiracy theorists talk about, there is a mainstream movement to get that thing started, but with divine mandate. In other words, it's worse than the conspiracy theorists actually say. And the thing is, you go talk to your friends and family about this, I'll bet a lot of them think it's a good idea. We're living in big, big times, friends. We're living in big, big times. Biblical times, one might say. Apocalyptic times, one might say. In the face of Armageddon, one might say. In a joint statement signed August the 3rd, leaders of both churches said that together they, quote, ask and pray for mutual forgiveness for any injuries inflicted in the past. We shall strive for this healing and purification of memories among our members, end quote, read the statement released on the occasion of the 500th anniversary celebration of the arrival of Christianity into the country, which is, of course, something that is worthy of celebration, in my opinion. Not worthy of a ecumenical linking, though. Anyways, the IFI formally broke away from Rome and declared itself a nationalist church in 1902, quote, in the midst of a turbulent period of the Filipino struggle for independence against the colonial rule of Spain and the United States, end quote, the statement said. The Philippines was under the control of Spain for 300 years until 1898, when the country declared its independence. The United States then ruled the country until 1945. Fun fact, this is despite the United States actually, quote, fighting for Cuban, Puerto Rican, and Filipino independence in the Spanish-American War. Definitely a patriot, but our government has done some pretty disgusting stuff in the Spanish-American War, I think, is an example of that. Anyways, the Philippines was, I just read that, quote, the formulation of the IFI was not against the Catholic Church. That's not true, but anyways. But rather against the continued domination of Spanish bishops and priests in the dioceses and parishes of the colony, end quote. Read the joint statement signed by the leaders of the Philippine Catholic Bishops Conference and the IFI bishops. Quote, as part of a nationalist resolution, the creation of the IFI was also signed, the creation of the IFI also, not was also, signified, and not signed, a religious revolution that appealed to the patriotic sentiments of the populace aspiring for the birth of a nation, end quote. Since the American colonial period up to the present, Christianity in the Philippines has evolved with a variety of traditions, said the church leaders. By the way, that variety of traditions goes back to that Amazonian synod we reported on back in 2019. You guys might remember, right? When the Pope said all rights, R-I-T-E-S, are worshiping of the self-same God, that is pushing forward for this perennialist ecumenical movement that seeks to establish a United Nations of religions, which is not a conspiracy theory. Again, it's mainstream news. You can look it up for yourself. Look up International Prayer at 2020, for example. Actually, it was 2021, March 2021. We actually reported on that here on the Watchdog, if you guys are interested. But anyways, the IFI entered into a partnership covenant with the United Church of Christ in the Philippines and became one of the member churches of the National Council of Churches in the Philippines and the World Council of Churches. Yes, the World Council of Churches rears its ugly head again. The World Council of Churches, which is supposed to be a group that is separate from the Catholic Church, and yet here's one, and this isn't the first, and it won't be the last member of their body signing into covenant with the Catholic Church, which, to be fair, the World Council of Churches symbolically did in September of 2018, also reported on, but back on our Facebook days, when they decided to have communion with each other on the 70-year anniversary of the World Council of Churches in Geneva, and that would be May of 2018. Again, you can look that up for yourselves. It also established concordance, of full communion. Yes, full communion with the Episcopal churches and with several churches in the Anglican Communion, the Old Catholic churches, the Union of, I'm going to say this wrong, Utrecht, and with the Church of Sweden. Yes, full communion with these groups. People think I exaggerate when I say they want to form one cohesive church body. No, that is precisely what they aim to do, and communion is the sign of that. Just think of the word communion, right? You are literally coming into communion with that body of Christ, right? Namely, that church. The IFI has also accepted women in the ordained ministry of the church, which is unbiblical, but that's obviously a subject for the other channel. The Catholic Church is the country, in the country has also grown in the appointment of numerous Filipino bishops, together with the diminishing role of foreign missionaries. Through the years, the church has opened its doors to ecumenical fellowship with other Christian churches. The Second Plenary Council of the Philippines in 1991 has also endorsed the true value of ecumenism in the area of faith, justice, peace, and development for lay faithful, clergy, and religious. I actually thought we were going to read this whole thing, but I think we're not going to, because I want to move on to the last article and then go ahead and cut this out, because it is 1 a.m. where I am. But anyways, this week's joint statement also called for the mutual recognition of baptisms between the IFI and the Catholic Church. In other words, if you're baptized into one group, you are considered baptized into the other. Again, I am not exaggerating when I say they are trying to form one cohesive church governmental body. It is their explicitly stated plans. Now, by the way, this article is from Angelus News, the Catholic news agency. In other words, it's an official Vatican source. And they don't think it's a negative, by the way. In other words, we're not getting this from InfoWars or Protestant lovers, the Pope is the Antichrist.com, right? That's not what we're doing here. We're not getting it from the homeless guy holding the end is nigh shirt. Or sign. I don't know why I said shirt. That was stupid. It's not who we're getting this from. We're getting this from the official documents, and the official sources, right? This week's joint statement also called for the mutual recognition of baptisms between the IFI and the Catholic Church. The Trinitarian baptismal formula of the IFI was already recognized by the Catholic Church in its list of validly administered baptisms by other Christian churches. And that is where we'll end the article, because, of course, it proves that the Catechism of the Catholic Church has always been ecumenical, and they're just simply finally passing that out to the rest of the world. Very threatening, very big threats. No good, no bueno. I do see there was a fact-checking for us. Tony Spell is actually in Baton Rouge, so I appreciate the fact-checking there. Good to correct the record before we actually leave here today. And last thing we're going to talk about, friends, is Antifa attacks praying Proud Boys in Portland. Again, link is in the description. Proud Boys Antifa clash with paintball guns, pepper spray at Portland prayer service. Can you say alliteration? Patrick Riley is the writer of this article, published August 8th, 2021 on the New York Post. And again, link is in the description. Far right and far left activists exchanged paintball fire and pepper spray in Portland. I don't think it's accurate to call the Proud Boys far right, but nonetheless, on Sunday, as the Proud Boys and anti-fascists, Antifa is more accurate, clashed at a controversial Canadian pastor's rally. A Christian group led by Pastor Artur Pawlowski, who, of course, is the famous one who yelled at the police saying, "Get out Nazis, get out Gestapo," if you guys recall that video went viral. Anyways, a Christian group led by Pastor Artur Pawlowski organized a prayer service at Tom McCall Waterfront Park, where about 50 people attended, and members of the Proud Boys appeared to be working as security armed with paintball guns and batons, reported the Portland Tribune. The service was disrupted by members of Antifa, clad in black, who began throwing smoke grenades and attempted to dismantle the group's PA system, the paper said. Videos on Twitter show the confrontation between the groups during the service. Andy Go actually published that first, by the way, where an individual in all black sprays what appears to be pepper spray at the speakers. Pawlowski is a well-known agitator in Canada, known for his brazen anti-homosexuality stance, and was arrested there in May for confronting law enforcement and calling them Nazis for enforcing COVID-19 restrictions. Now, let me go ahead and translate that into not completely insane speak, because apparently the New York Post has completely drinking the Kool-Aid. But here's the actual facts as far as this is concerned. Pawlowski is a well-known pastor in Canada, known for his brazen pro-Bible stance on marriage, and he was arrested there in May for confronting law enforcement, calling them Nazis, rightfully so, for their enforcement of tyrannical health mandates around the COVID-19 pandemic. Sorry, you just had to edit that absolute crap that we saw here in the allegedly conservative New York Post. But I continue. He was found guilty of contempt in June for hosting large maskless gatherings for church services in Calgary and denied health officials entry to the church. By the way, I do recommend you guys click on the article for one thing and one thing only. Obviously, you can read it for yourself if you want to, but for these videos here that we're not actually going to watch, which give you the ability to see it a little bit more firsthand, but I am trying to get out of here and get to bed. Anyways, the religious service lasted about 90 minutes, the Portland Tribune said, before both sides began to get in each other's faces. The altercation spilled into nearby streets. Andy Nago's videos, by the way, very clearly prove that this was Antifa agitating. They literally attacked these, quote, Proud Boys while they were praying. Artur Pawlowski is not a Proud Boy, just to be clear. There were Proud Boys there playing defense, right? But the mischaracterization of this as a Proud Boy rally is not accurate, or even as a rally is not accurate, right? It really was a fellowship called by a pastor, right? But nonetheless, the religious service, as if my point couldn't possibly be more proven, lasted for about 90 minutes, the Portland Tribune said, before both sides began to get in each other's faces. The altercation spilled into nearby streets where the groups continued fighting and exchanging pepper spray on the sidewalk in front of stores. A video freelance journalist Sergio Holmes shows. I think it is actually Sergio. I don't know. Anyways, the video shows a police vehicle responding to the action but not intervening because, of course, Portland police are absolutely useless, and those who don't want to be absolutely useless are absolutely handicapped by their useless government. But at any rate, quote, the Nazis came out and we drove them off again, end quote. Wade Varner, a 64-year-old Navy veteran who served on the submarine tender USS Fulton, told the Portland Tribune. He was talking about the Proud Boys. Varner said he was passing through the park when he decided to get involved. Quote, I'm sitting here totally unarmed in a wheelchair, and this effer shoots me in the face with a paintball. Antifa had threatened to beat people up and do what they do, and when they showed up, and did it, end quote, an unarmed attendee from the right-wing side told the paper. Quote, the police were not even far from where they were and were laughing in their vehicles and doing their thing. It's probably hard to care as an officer in a place where they take away your funding, end quote. And that ends the article there, but you see something that is very important to note, considering the fact that what did we start this article, or excuse me, this episode talking about? We, of course, started it talking about Julian Assange being arrested, moved on to the judge ordering Amos Miller to pay fines or be, again, arrested. Moved there to the headline article that got you to click, of course, which is the massively, exponentially rising support for secession. And now we end it with violence in the streets that, though not deadly, definitely goes to make the point. We are living under a tyrannical regime that is getting more tyrannical as days go on and seems to be getting more tyrannical despite the changing faces going from Obama to Bush, or excuse me, Bush to Obama. But really, you know, went back before even Bush, to Trump, to Biden, and so on until, of course, the end of time. It is less tyrannical than the overwhelming majority of regimes in the rest of the world. And in fact, less tyrannical probably than all of the rest of the regimes in the rest of the world. But it's still tyrannical from the perspective that the constitutionalist takes. And that's the only correct perspective one can take, in my opinion. We're living under a tyrannical regime. We're living in a violent age. We're living in what could be the ultimate breakup of our union. And if it happens, it happens. You know, who knows what's going to go on. But nonetheless, this has been CJ Cox with the Watchdog. I appreciate you guys being here today. If you liked this video, please remember to like and share this video. Get it out to all the different social media platforms you partake in. Of course, what good is a message without an audience to hear it? And if you think this news is important, then of course it is a message that is indeed worthy of an audience. If you think that I am worthy of getting these messages out as a career, please consider giving to the Patreon. You can give as much as you like or as little as you like. And of course, you help me to turn this into a career. I do at some point plan on having an actual website where I can set up a subscription service and stuff like that so that you guys don't have to worry about third parties and stuff like that. But nonetheless, that is what we have now. And if you guys do feel led to give there, I greatly appreciate you. Please remember to subscribe on BitChute and Parler. Links are in the description. You can find me at TheCynicogue on both of those places. Excuse me, BitChute and Rumble. But you should also go to Parler, as well as Gab and Minds. Get on independent social media platforms and fight against the overlords with your dollar, so to speak. Also, you can still find us, of course, on Facebook and Twitter if you are in those areas. Look me up as TheCynicogue. I'm going to have a different display name on whatever social media website you're on, but I will have the tag name TheCynicogue regardless of which one you go to. TheCynicogue News, of course, being the YouTube channel here. Thank you for watching this video, those of you who did. The number one thing you can do for our algorithm is actually watching as much of the video as possible. Questions, comments, criticisms, concerns, anything like that in the comment section below. Links to all social media and articles used in the description below. And please get different hashtags if you do share these in biblical times, or will you compromise, or both, just as a way to try and get people to get this video trending. Obviously, if that sort of thing happens, it's an absolute long shot and a blessing, but we want to go ahead and shoot for it anyways. And with that, my friends, I will just say to you, remember to be watchdogs and ask yourself this. In the face of Armageddon, will you compromise?